The legislature's back in session. I think when we broke, we were trying to resolve a couple of issues. Senator Nicholas, did you?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In consultation with my colleagues, I'd like to withdraw my proposed amendment to the amendment.
Thank you. So we're now on just the amendment by Senator Merrick Macho Torres. Anyone wish to be heard? Yes, Senator Torres.
Mr. Speaker, when we left off, there was a request to legal counsel that we clarify whether the original language, non-government entity versus what exists in the amendment right now is not-for-profit sports organization stands. I would recommend, Mr. Speaker, that before we vote on the amendment that I in fact change the word not-for-profit sports organization to a non-profit organization. And that way it's consistent with the language in statute on many levels.
All right.
Okay. So now it reads only partner with a non-profit organization.
Okay, does everybody understand that Senator Torres is recommending that she amend her amendment to strike for and sports? So it just reads non-profit organization. Any objection? Anyone wish to be heard? All right, so the amendment to her amendment is accepted. On the main amendment that was proffered, any objection to the Camacho Torres amendment? Madam Vice Speaker, did I see your hand go up?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the amendment as amended, I'm concerned that the substitute bill had removed Section 4 entirely, which was an authorization to enter into a partnership with a nonprofit. And I thought that was a great idea. I think that was really the only controversy that this bill had was, you know, what that relationship was going to look like between the mayor's office and a nonprofit. So I thought removing this authorization was good, because if they wanted to do it in the future, they would have to come back here and get some kind of review by the legislature and some authorization, unless they were authorized to do it by some other law that currently exists, and that's not been made clear to us. But this amendment seems to indirectly put that authorization back in, and I'm not sure if that's the intent, because it says the mayor may only partner with a not-for-profit organization. And so I understand the rest of it, that if they partner, then they should, you know, be transparent. But I guess I'm concerned about putting this authorization back into the bill. So I thought, I don't know, I guess I still do have concerns because it's just so open-ended, what this partnership might look like, what is for, and all the concerns that were brought out in the public hearing that no one could answer at the time. I just don't think we should approve it in advance. And if he's authorized right now to make arrangements that really don't give any liability to the government of Guam or obligate the government of Guam, he might be able to enter into those types of partnerships right away. But when we're going to put obligations on the government towards some other entity, I think it requires additional scrutiny, which I know is the intent of this amendment, but I object to the part that gives that authorization back in. I was also thinking that the last sentence of this amendment says the office of the mayor must ensure that the facility is maintained. That's fine. But then this part, so as to provide equal and open access to members of the public as well as community sports organizations. I think the mayor of Talafofo in particular was very clear that he's been allowing the facilities, and I want to commend him for allowing the facilities in his village to be used by everyone, but that, you know, he thought that there should be some kind of priority for Talafofo activities, of course. And in order for this, I don't know, I just thought that by requiring equal and open access to members of the public was actually, it sounds simple, but it might actually become an impediment, that we have to create equal access in Talafofo to members of villages, other villages. This is, you know, we've seen this in the news for certain villages, and it seems to me that the communities want a kind of priority access for their villages. But it's just a, so I was just a little concerned about that. So that's why I was hoping that we could get the mayors to be the ones to actually come up with the rules that they want, and if they do it through a AAA process, those would be vetted public. It would satisfy all the public notice and open and transparency requirements of the government if they did it that way. So that's the reason I object to this amendment as it reads, Mr. Speaker, because I don't want to put back into this bill what I thought was a good substitution when they took out that authorization. Thank you.
Thank you. So there's been an objection. Any other senator wish to be heard on the Camacho-Torres amendment? Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just want to point out something, and I understand the intent of this amendment as was kind of discussed at a previous meeting. But if we take a look at this, the construction of the language in here is that the Office of the Mayor and the Municipal Planning Council may only partner with a nonprofit organization after undertaking transparent procedures to ensure public awareness of the relative costs, benefits, and risks of the project, actively consulting and engaging all relevant stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. I guess if we look at perhaps the unintended consequence of this language, and that means that they may only partner with a nonprofit organization after the transparent procedures are put into place. It doesn't speak to entering into a for-profit organization with the same kind of requirements. And I think that's one of the things that I think we need to at least make sure we understand, because if the Municipal Planning Council and the Mayor's Office decides to enter in an agreement with a for-profit organization, they are not held to the same standards as entering into an agreement with a nonprofit organization. And so I bring that to the attention of this body and the author of this amendment, perhaps to consider. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to thank the sponsor of the amendment, because in the public hearing there was a lot of concern about whether it should, which nonprofit it was going to go to, how do we choose which nonprofit can invest in it. And one of the concerns were answered very simply by someone who gave testimony. And it's basically give the mayor the authority to work with the community for this property. It promotes extracurricular activities that are positive and conducive for the town, for the village. And I know that with the substituted version that the sponsor did, clearly relays that authority to the mayor. And so I feel that if we add in this amendment, it would just complicate things further. So that's all I have to say. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? On the amendment, Senator Camacho-Torres.
Mr. Speaker, I think I clearly was reacting to all the circumstances that were presented at the public hearing. And, you know, providing a layer of transparency. But I believe, though, that with all the concerns that were raised and with an additional recommendation that perhaps another process for vetting be introduced, that maybe this amendment is not necessary after all, and that there could be another layer of scrutiny and involvement by the public that is probably more appropriate. I was reacting when I drafted this to what we believed was the end-all of the legislation as presented and with all the testimony that was provided at the public hearing. So at this time, I think, you know, I thank everybody for giving it the thorough thought, and I think at this point I'll just withdraw the amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator. On the motion to withdraw, hearing no objection. On the main motion, I have Senator Morrison and then the Vice Speaker. You have an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to rise in support of this measure. I thank the author for his continuous efforts. Recently, we passed legislation to support another southern community to also have some more expanded area so they can proceed with their facilities. And here's another one before us in the village of Talafofo. At one point, the sport of baseball was the most dominant sport on the island. And as you can see today, there's a lot of competing activities out there, a lot of competing sports that even with football, soccer, rugby, that they're using the baseball fields for their practices, for games, and for whatever activities that relates to their sport. But, you know, this effort that is being made, Mr. Speaker, we have to also realize that in the southern communities, at least compared to what's in the central or north, the facilities down south are not clearly good or or better than these facilities that are up north, and it's good to see these efforts being made down south. Talafofo, the mayor, has made it very clear that even with their new facility, you know, there's been a high demand there. I think they pointed out in the testimony there's over 300 athletes on that field at one time from different sports, and you know, just knowing it's a ball field, they're still finding a way to accommodate these athletes. So appreciate the author working with these organizations, working with the mayor, and seeing how we can expand facilities for other competing sports out there, so that, you know, we can address this growing demand. What's important to point out, Mr. Speaker, is that even in the transfer station in Agate, I know this legislature has placed a lot, I think in the size of around 40 acres under the jurisdictions of the Department of Parks and Recreation, and that was to be a southern sports complex. And we still haven't gotten that off the ground yet. And that was to address the demand of the southern community, and growth of competing sports, and to accommodate other activities not related mainly to sport, but as we see in Harmon, what took place with just 2 soccer fields now ended up with a ball field, a gym, and other sports are taking place up there. So appreciate the author. I'd like to see more bills like these types going forward, and see how we can accommodate the many organizations out there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Morrison. Vice Speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too want to rise in support of the bill. I think the Mayor Talafofo has shown that with the facilities that he currently has, he is very capable of managing them and managing them fairly, and he's allowed community sports to really benefit from the limited facilities in Talafofo. Even they benefit like members from all over the South and not just Talafofo, and I know that for a fact, but I think, so I stand in support of the bill, and I thank the author for this bill and the work that he has done. I wanted to make a couple amendments. One is, in the supplemental committee report, yeah, there was a letter from W.B. Flores and Associates. The mayor had asked W.B. Flores to comment, I guess, on the flood constraints, because the flood constraints was an issue that was brought up by the Department of Land Management. So the mayor denied that there were any issues, and W.B. Flores and Associates pretty much also agrees that he doesn't see any issues, but he does say in his letter, which is what I put into my floor amendment, that proper storm management should be designed into the sports facility for water quality, recharge, and storage requirements, and to prevent runoff from affecting the street on the east boundary, which is the lowest point on Lot 1, Block 14, Tract 2831, consisting of, and then the description of the property. So I would like to just put this in as a floor amendment, just to be absolutely sure that everybody pays attention to this, because sometimes, you know, it just gets overlooked. So it's been brought to our attention by land management. It's again brought to our attention by W.B. Flores. So I'm hoping that it doesn't create any problem, because the mayor was agreeing that he would, of course, not cause any problem to adjacent facilities. So that would be my amendment, is this, the first one regarding storm management. Does that sound weird?
On the Tulahi amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Estevez. Any other senator after Senator Estevez? Okay, Senator, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this amendment, though I do have concern again on validating, because as I understand it, there are already laws requiring storm management and water runoff with the plans, engineering plans, but to ensure that they're doing this to standard in the construction of the facility, if perhaps the author of the amendment would be willing to add a section in here to work in conjunction with appropriate agencies such as Guam EPA and Land Management to ensure the compliance. Because the Office of the Mayor of Talafofo Municipal Planning Council, while they have a requirement to ensure that this stuff is being done, I think the regulating agencies should have kind of a say in the matter, or should be really the where we put the focus on, because they're the ones that are going to be enforcing these laws with the engineering plans and the construction of the facility. So if I'd like to propose an amendment to the amendment, and it will read, the Office of the Mayor of Talafofo, cross out the and, comma, the Talafofo Municipal Planning Council, comma, and all relative agencies shall ensure that proper storm management, and it continues on. That way they have, within the enabling legislation or the mandate to the municipal council and the mayors, that there's also a mandate for the agencies to support this endeavor and ensure compliance.
Thank you very much, Senator Estevez. On the Estevez amendment to the Tulahi amendment.
Excuse me, Mr. Speaker, sorry. Relevant, not relative. Yeah. Relevant agencies.
Any objection to the amendment? On the main amendment as amended, the Tulahi amendment as amended, any other senator wish to be heard? Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in full support of this amendment, and that's because at the public hearing on this particular bill, it was the Director of Land Management who expressed concern and really asked that the legislature require that there be no backfilling or leveling off of this field. And his main concern was, again, the percolation of water, and there would be no area for storm runoff to be able to recharge the aquifer or the underground. And so it was a concern of mine, and especially the day after the public hearing, because the day after the public hearing, we had some torrential rains that came down, and I think all of us received video footage of George Washington High School in which there was flooding because of the rain. There was flooding in the hallways, there was flooding down the stairs, there was knee-deep in many areas of the school, and it caused concern for me because if this, relative to this particular piece, all of a sudden the concern that was raised by land management became a lot more real, that if there was no place for the water after a torrential rain like that to drain, then the surrounding areas could definitely be affected. And of course, we all kind of have an inkling of what the mayor of Talafofo and the residents of Talafofo would like to do with this field. They would like to level off and create some playing fields, in particular for the sport of soccer and perhaps even football. But again, the concern and the caution of the Director of Land Management was, again, the water runoff. So I rise in full support of this amendment to the amendment because it does provide to have that concern addressed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Espaldon. Any other senator wish to be heard? If not, Madam Vice Speaker, you're welcome to close. All right. Since there's no objection, do you have any further amendments or
Yes, Mr.
comments
Speaker,
on the main?
thank you. Pretty much because we have seen in the news recently issues arise that, I mean, of course the mayors, we're putting them in a position to deal with these things, and they've done a very, very good job. But I'm hoping that this next amendment of mine will help to deter any conflicts that we might not foresee today or that they have not really experienced to date. And as we know, things change very quickly. And so I have another amendment that I would like to add to this bill, which requires that the office of the mayor of or the Municipal Planning Council adopt rules and regulations pursuant to the AAA. And I put AAA, Mr. Speaker, so that those are already standard ways of giving notice, standard ways of having hearings, standard ways of how the public will know what it is that the mayor intends to do. That these rules will govern the use and access to this lot. It's my intention that this would govern the use of any facilities that's built here, and just so that if they want to prioritize Talafofo and they put that as in parts of their rules and regs and have public hearing on it, then we'll see where that goes. If they want to say it's going to be equal access to everybody, that they do that then in their rules, and the public has opportunity to also comment on that or require, ask for other things be considered. But I think just as our island grows, that the rules would be just help to guide the mayors, and the mayors change also. So from one mayor to another, we sometimes see in the villages that the rules change very quickly when we switch mayors. So it's also to just allow some consistency for people that are hoping to use these fields. And if it does end up to be a soccer field only or whatever sports, I appreciate the bill because it leaves it broad enough that they could develop a multi-purpose sports facility or whatever it is that the community desires. So that would be my other amendment, Mr. Speaker, to this bill, and I ask for the support.
Just for clarification, Madam Vice Speaker, where exactly did you want AAA?
Just another section, Mr. Speaker, so I would leave it to legal to put it in there before the severability clause someplace.
Okay. So it's to be a new section written by...
Passed it out.
Huh?
I passed it out, Mr. Speaker? Yeah, it's to add a new section. It says use and access to property.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, on this amendment, Senator Ada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the amendment certainly is very good. It lays down the the ground rules from the very beginning. I just have a question, though. It requires that the rules and regulations shall be adopted, shall be formulated. And if they don't?
Madam Vice Speaker, do you wish to?
It's an excellent question, Mr. Speaker, that I've tried to think what the answer might. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure whether that restricts, but I was thinking that in the time it takes to develop the field, they could have rules and regs done so that hopefully it wouldn't be an impediment.
On the Vice Speaker's amendment, any senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Senator San Augustine.
Mr. Speaker, on that amendment, the shall, maybe it should be should or will adopt, because the shall actually opens a lot of doors. I don't know if I shall or I could or I would. You know, it's coulda, woulda, shoulda program.
Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the amendment, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to propose that we make the amendment insert it prior to Section 3 of the Act, and then in order to create the mechanism by which would require this new amendment to be effective in the current Section 3, which would become a new which would be pushed forward to Section 4, we can say subject to Section 3 of this Act, administrative jurisdiction of the lot is transferred. That way, the rules and regulations to govern the use will have to be in place before the administrative jurisdiction of the lot is transferred. So I would like to make an amendment to specify that this amendment that we're debating right now be the new Section 3.
On the San Nicolas amendment, Senator Adams.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I really appreciate the how we're trying to corral everything in so that nothing, goes out of the corral here, but it just seems like we're trying to make it so hard for these folks. All we want to do is we want to earmark this 8-acre lot. I think we've put enough safeguards in there, and now to make the transfer of administrative jurisdiction contingent upon, I mean, it's good. It's good that we require it and somehow, put it in a way, but I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if it's not our cynicism that causes us to make all these amendments that, you got to do this and you got to plug that and before anything happens. My gosh, all they want is a sports field. So, certainly the amendment I think is good. The last amendment to the amendment about making the transfer subject to the adoption of rules and regs. I don't know. I guess maybe that's where my problem is. I'm just too trusting. Thank you.
Is that an objection to the amendment? Do I take that to be an objection to the amendment? No, okay. Madam Vice Speaker?
On the amendment to the amendment, I can see the benefit of that, Mr. Speaker, but I too am just a little worried that I didn't want the rules to be an impediment, but really to be a benefit, and I'm afraid that making the transaction, because I would like the mayor to get administrative authority over this property immediately as soon as the governor signs the bill, because I know he wants to do a little bit of clearing on it and other things. So I would like him to be able to start all those things, and so I just think, I think that necessarily mayors, they come up with rules. Otherwise they would be, and I know this mayor in particular, he says, he's trying to be fair. All the mayors, they necessarily have already come up with rules, and the rules don't have to be complicated. They could be simple. They could say, first come, first serve. That's the rule. Or whatever rule that they've already been using for their other sports facilities, they could adopt those as their rules, especially interim rules or immediate rules, and those can grow as they go along. So yeah, I am also worried that it might become an impediment that we really don't intend, because we want him to get this property immediately. We want him to work it, to develop it into a usable piece of property. So, but I do understand the intent, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So maybe we're going to have to divide the amendment. The first amendment would be to place your amendment as the new Section 3 and renumber the subsequent sections. Is there any objection to that? So no objection to that. The second part of the amendment was to make, in the new Section 4, the grant of administrative jurisdiction contingent on compliance with the Section 3 that requires the Administrative Adjudication Act.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, but just a point of order. The amendment to the amendment was to specify that the amendment would be the new Section 3.
Yes.
Now that that's passed, we're still on the amendment that is the new Section 3. The amendment that you are discussing there would need to be a separate motion. So we would need to first dispose of the amendment.
Okay. So is there any objection to the Terlahi amendment being Section 3 and it goes forward as is? All right? No objection. Senator Snickles, you're recognized on an amendment.
On the amendment?
No, on your amendment
motion.
to 4, yeah, on your main motion.
On the main motion, Mr. Speaker, on the new Section 4 that reads grant of administrative jurisdiction, I'd like to just add the language at the beginning, subject to Section 3 of this Act. Yes, on the Section 4, the new
Yes.
Section 4, which is right now Section 3, but it's now
Right.
been pushed to Section 4. In the beginning of Section 4, have it read, subject to Section 3 of this Act, administrative jurisdiction of Lot 1.
All right, so the Snickles amendment is to add a few words at the very beginning of the section, making it contingent. Any senator wish to be heard on this Snickles amendment to the new Section 4? Anyone? Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate what the move of the amendment is trying to do because of the concerns that were raised previously. However, the new Section 3, which we just adopted, basically requires that the rules and the regulations will be adopted pursuant to the administrative adjudication law. And we all know that that takes sometimes not only processes, but time periods. And I think the real intent, as spoken to by the author and several of our colleagues on the floor, is really just to get this in the hands of the mayor's office so they can start the process already of further developing this piece of property for the intended purposes. And so if we accept this new amendment now, there will be no movement on any kind of development subject to until after the whole process of adopting the rules according to the AAA process. And so that in itself may take some time. I think it was expressed by the previous speaker is that, you know, perhaps there's a way that this all could be moved all simultaneously so that it could be usable. This property can be used for the youth sports facilities and for other activities as quickly as possible. This might be a hindrance to that forward movement. Just my observation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Senator Ada.
Well, in listening to the retiring speaker, I think he brings up a good point. In view of the fact that the amendment to require the rules and regs be adopted pursuant to the AAA process, if I understand the AAA process, they have to conduct the hearing out there. Then it has to go through the governor's office. Bureau of Planning looks at it. They make their recommendation to him. He sends it down to here, and then we have to adopt those rules and regs by statute. And is that really what we want? Man flourish ay tanantangan gilu antus di funodzen.
The new Section 3 has already been adopted. The issue now before the body is whether or not it's going to be transfer of administrative jurisdiction is going to be contingent on compliance. So that's the motion before the floor that has been made by Senator Nicholas. Is there an objection to it? Oh, okay. Senator Addett, you want to speak?
Well, since you've clarified then that the amendment that required the rules and regs by through the AAA process, that has passed, then maybe the appropriate motion is, if I recall, for the body to reconsider that particular action and see if we really want it to go that route. So I think we need to take care of that first, and then the other amendment here. But I guess if that's a proper motion to make for the body to reconsider that action.
There's a motion to reconsider the action of the body as it relates to what is now the new Section 3. Any senator wish to be heard on the motion to reconsider? Any objection to reconsidering? Objection by to objection. Did you wish to speak or just object?
Mr. Speaker, the motion for the amendment of the new Section 3 was already duly passed by the body. While I do understand the concern of motioning to reconsider, the process, the intent of the AAA process with this is that it'll happen during the construction of the facility itself. So there should be enough time for the rules to be promulgated before the facility can be utilized. But nowhere in Section 3 does it prohibit the construction of the facility itself. I just want to clarify that for the record. That's what the other amendment would do. So again, I object to reconsidering it. I think the Section 3 is fine as it is, and I don't think it's going to be an impediment as it is by itself without any other amendments to it.
There's been an objection to the reconsideration. Did you wish to speak again? Please.
So what the retiring speaker brings up is that things can continue moving. If there was going to be any construction while the rules and regs are being put together, it can continue moving, right? But it's kind of like one of those sort of things where, first of all, it's not the question of how much effort is it going to take to put up the rules and regulations, I mean, it could be a one-liner that basically says first come, first serve. Right? That addresses the issue of how the place is going to be utilized. The challenge is, you know, first you got to put out and read the law on the AAA. It is about as cumbersome as, that's why government moves at the snail pace. You got to put out the notice in so many days. You got to do the hearing. Okay, fine. It makes its way down to Bureau of Planning. But there's no timeline that it has to make its way down here, and then it comes down here again. You know, there's no timeline down here, so it's just, my goodness. And then why would they want to? Why would they want to undertake construction if the grant of administrative jurisdiction is going to be contingent upon the adoption of rules and regulations? So, you know, so that's a concern that I have. It's just kind of pitting one against the other.
Senator Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, just for clarification, those are two completely separate issues. The amendment that's on the floor right now is to make the construction of the facility and the transfer of and utilization of the lot contingent on Section 3. That's the amendment being proposed right now, as I understand it. Well, that's the amendment, but not the motion being proposed right now.
Right.
But as it stands right now, with Section 3 in place, has nothing to do with anything being contingent aside from the mayor has to require. It doesn't even say the mayor is restricted from using the facility. It just says the mayor shall develop rules and regulations for the facility consistent with the AAA process. But right now there is nothing in Section 3 that prohibits its construction or prohibits its use. It just puts in statute that this is something that the mayor has to undertake, which could take a year, could take shorter. That's really the prerogative of the mayor and his constituency to push the issue forward. So just to clarify for the record, what we're asking for right now, we're asking to reconsider, we're asking for a motion to reconsider an amendment that has no prohibitions right now.
All right.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. We're entertaining a motion to reconsider previous action, but we have not disposed of my motion to amend the new Section 4, which is, I think, what we need to dispose of first before we go back and consider a motion to reconsider. I have not vacated my motion to amend the new Section 4, and if we're still going to be entertaining my motion on Section 4, I would like the opportunity to close on that motion, Mr. Speaker.
I understand your point, Senator Nicholas, but the point that was raised by the mover of the motion to reconsider is, why should we vote on your motion to make the contingent transfer if we're going to reconsider and remove Section 3? There would be no Section 3 to reconsider if we vote on your motion. So,
understood, Mr. Speaker, but the motion to amend and add that new Section 3 has already passed. And so since it's already passed, even though it may be up for consideration at a future time, we are now on my amendment to amend the new Section 4. So unless I vacate my amendment to Section 4 for a reconsideration motion to be entertained, we are still on my motion to amend Section 4.
All right. The good senator is correct. The motion on the floor that has not been disposed of is his motion to add the contingent transfer. Is there an objection to the motion to the contingent transfer? There is an objection. Do you wish to close?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to close. First of all, Mr. Speaker, I fully support the intent of the bill. And the reason why I'm adding this new amendment in is not to create some kind of, government hurdle that's unnecessary. Mr. Speaker, we've had a lot of discussion on this measure. We've talked about the concerns for flooding, and we added an amendment in there for that. We've talked about the concerns for access, and we attempted to add an amendment in for that as well. If we allow for the mandate for rules and regs to go in, but for it to just be kind of floating out there in the air, then there is nothing that's going to require that those questions be addressed prior to the development of the field. As a matter of fact, as was mentioned earlier in the discussion, someone brought up, well, what if this isn't done at all? And there is no consequence to that. And so the amendment to require flood mitigation, the amendment to, or the concerns brought up about access, all of those could go completely unresolved because the administrative jurisdiction would have already transferred, the MOU would have already been executed, and there would have been no process, no step within that process that would have required any of these things to be taken care of in advance. So I fully support the intent. What I'm trying to do is make sure that everything that all this work that we're doing for flood mitigation or to make sure there's access, I'm just trying to make sure all that work gets done before everything gets turned over and completed. If we do these rules and regs before the lot is transferred, the administrative jurisdiction of the lot is transferred, all we're asking is for the administrative adjudication law to be followed. And so the mayor would have to put together rules and regulations that are going to, based on the amendment that we adopted, that govern the use and access to the lot. And so if the use is going to be for a sports field, then that use must also, with the other amendment we adopted, ensure that flood mitigation takes place. The access would need to be addressed in the rules and regs because that's part of the amendment that we already adopted. That AAA process will involve the entire community. There'll be a public hearing. The party that's interested in building the facility will come up and testify. And they'll say, yes, we're going to do flood mitigation. They'll say, yes, we're going to ensure access under these conditions. The community will be made aware of that. And then, after all that AAA process has gone through, and yes, the rules and regs are adopted and they go through the process of going up to the administration, when those rules and regs are finally transmitted down here, if this body doesn't act, after so many days, they automatically lapse into law. And then those rules and regs govern the development of the sports facility. Right now, I mean, people are talking about expediting this and government getting in the way. Mr. Speaker, the last thing we're going to want to do is to build a sports facility where 5 years from now there's a flood and somebody's house is underwater. And then we come back and say, oh, that was in the bill, but oh, it just never got done. Well, why did you transfer the property in the first place if you weren't going to make sure that it was going to get done? Or the last thing we want is 5 years, 10 years from now, the field is built and some group wants to go out there and start using it that's not a part of the organization that built the field, and the organization says, oh, no, you can't come in here. And they say, wait a minute, wasn't that public land? Oh, yeah, no, but under this MOU, it says you can't come in here. Or we can decide who comes in here. Or if you come in here, we're going to charge you $1,000 a night. And all of a sudden, the community in Talafofo who wants to go up there and play kickball can't. Mr. Speaker, I'm not trying to get in the way of the transaction. I haven't heard a single person up here at all today in discussion of this measure say that they don't want this thing to happen. I do. But let's just make sure that our eyes are wide open and the community is fully aware of what's happening. And prior to anything being executed, the commitments are already locked in under law that certain things are going to happen and be taken care of. Flooding is going to be mitigated. Access is going to be clearly delineated as to who can come in under what terms and conditions. Otherwise, what are we doing all these amendments for if we're not going to ensure that they're going to be enforced prior to the lot being transferred? Government sometimes, Mr. Speaker, isn't supposed to be, expedited, especially when it comes to making sure that the community isn't going to be adversely impacted by its actions. Flood mitigation is no small matter, and access to land that was once public but is now being afforded to a particular group, access is no small matter either. So I humbly ask my colleagues, I know that there's been some objections, but there's nothing wrong with us making sure the rules and regulations are put in place prior to the land being transferred. I really can't see what's wrong with that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The motion proffered by the good senator, there's been an objection. All those in favor of the senator's amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. Oh, wait, no. What was the count? I saw 6. Motion fails, I'm sorry. Oh, wait. Senator Etta, you had a motion for reconsideration. Do you still wish to move forward with it? All right. There's a motion for reconsideration by Senator Etta of the action of the body as it relates to the new Section 3 that was offered by the Vice Speaker. There's been an objection to Yes, no, I understand. It's her Section 3. Yeah. Yes, it's passed, and you're asking for a motion to reconsider. And if I understand correctly, was there an objection over on this side? So there's been an objection to your motion to reconsider. Any other senator wish to be heard on the motion to reconsider? Senator Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand there's an objection to Mr. Speaker, but I pointed out earlier with recent measures like this, and just one we did with the community of Umatag with the sports facility expanding jurisdiction or control under the municipality. It's similar legislation, Mr. Speaker, so I just want to point out that we're setting some type of precedents going forward, and I'm just concerned that other jurisdiction transfers of the past that we may have to reevaluate because we never required the municipality or the mayor subject to the AAA process when we were transferring these facilities or properties over. Another thing I want to point out, Mr. Speaker, is but by doing this, I think, I'm just concerned if the motion fails or passes, or the objection sustains, or I'm just concerned of the vote because I'm thinking that we may have to reevaluate some of these similar jurisdiction transfers or assets transfers over. We never we just did one recently, and we didn't require them to go under the AAA process.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the motion to reconsider? Senator Esteves?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I understand the sentiment of the retiring speaker about how this hasn't been done before, something actually occurred recently since the last time we passed legislation that was similar, where there was an incident between constituents and the Municipal Planning Council and the mayor. And it became publicized. And so the question became, what were the rules? Who was right? Who was wrong? There was really nothing there. Does the mayor have the authority to dictate or to control the facility, to take care of it for his constituents? Is it open to the public? There was nothing there to establish any of that. And as the author of the amendment had stated, it depends every time a new mayor comes in. The rules could change. So having rules be put in place that go through the process, the public process of the AAA process, I think is important. Again, with the AAA process, there's nothing in the amendment, and even applying it to potentially applying it to other municipalities, there's nothing prohibitive with the use of the fields. It just places a mandate that must be done. So the process must be started. And then as legislators, it's our responsibility to have oversight to ensure that those mandates are being met. So as long as, for me, as long as they're starting the process to develop rules that the public has input into, that they can voice their concerns, whether they're from the village or outside of the village, to ensure the community has input, I think is important, because that's the difference between the legislation recently passed and the legislation we have before us today, is there was an incident. And so if we can take lessons from that and prevent future friction with the constituents and the responsibilities we are mandating of the mayors and the MPCs, then I think we should take those measures into consideration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Esteves. Any other senator before we go back to the mover? Any other senator wish to be heard? If not, Senator Ada, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the reason why I asked to reconsider this particular amendment relative to the use and access of property is I'm in full support of the idea of having to adopt rules and regulations. What I have an objection to is that the adoption of these rules and regulations will be pursuant to the AAA process. And again, it's a very lengthy process. However, that's not to say that, you know, we shouldn't put this out in the open. So, you know, maybe a more appropriate language could be something like the Office of the Mayor of Talafofo or the Talafofo Municipal Planning Council shall adopt rules and regulations at a duly noticed MPC meeting, period.
I think we're going to have to deal with your motion to reconsider unless because you're amending the amendment that's in there at this
well,
point.
And I guess I'm just saying then that's why I would like to reconsider this amendment so that we can go back and remove that obstacle.
Okay. Well, the motion is now before the floor.
Okay.
And there's been an objection. All those in favor of the motion to reconsider, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes. We're back on section 3, and Senator Addett, you're recognized for your proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make an amendment on the Terlahi amendment regarding the use and access of property so that it reads as follows. The Office of the Mayor of Talafofo or the Talafofo Municipal Planning Council shall adopt rules and regulations at a duly noticed MPC meeting, period, and delete the words pursuant to the administrative adjudication law. At a duly noticed MPC meeting to govern the use and access to the lot.
Is everybody clear on the amendment being proffered by Senator Addett? Is everybody clear on the amendment being proffered by Senator Addett? If you're clear, any senator wish to be heard on the amendment being proffered? Senator San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to clarify, if these rules and regulations are going to be adopted by the mayor for the municipality, and it kind of brings me to the greater question of the overall measure. I know we're transferring the administrative jurisdiction of the land to the Talafofo mayor for the development of a sports facility. This amendment will allow for the mayor to, or will require the mayor to adopt rules and regulations with respect to the use of the land. To govern the use and access of the lot. Now, I wanted to kind of think this thing through. So let's say that the lot transfers over and the mayor enters into an agreement with a nonprofit organization to develop a sports facility, which we all know is what's planned. And this organization builds this facility. Do these rules and regs that are adopted by the mayor at this duly noticed MPC meeting, do those rules and regs supersede any rules and regs that the organization may adopt? Or are the organization's rules and regs, do they have to be consistent with the rules and regs adopted by the mayor? I mean, I'm getting a little concerned as to who has governing jurisdiction over the property with respect to the development and enforcement of rules and regs. So if this amendment goes through, and if it passes, and then the mayor goes out and this organization builds a sports facility there, are the mayor's rules and regs the ones that govern? Or will the organization be able to adopt rules and regs of their own that are more or less stringent than the mayor's? And that's why I was wanting it to be done prior to the lot even transferring, because then everything is in place before the lot even goes into any kind of jurisdiction. But now that we're not making that a requirement, whose rules are going to govern the property? The rules of the mayor or the rules of the organization that is developing the facility?
I would imagine that's in the agreement between the mayor and the municipal planning council and the not-for-profit. I mean, they would put that into the agreement as to, I would think, but I didn't know. Okay. Anybody wish to address the concern raised by the retiring speaker? Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just have one question if the sponsor of the amendment would yield. And the question would be, the way it's phrased, at a duly recognized meeting. The proposal is to delete the administrative adjudication process, which would require a public hearing, and then forwarding the information to the governor's office and then eventually to this legislative body for final adoption. There's nothing here that says the proposed rules and regulations that would more or less govern the use of this parcel of property indefinitely into the future, that there's no public hearing that will be conducted. So if I could just ask the sponsor for clarity whether that particular requirement will no longer exist with the proposed amendment.
Do you yield?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, the amendment was to add the new language, but also to delete the phrase pursuant to the administrative adjudication law. I don't know if that answers the question.
When you delete, if I may, Mr. Speaker, when you delete the administrative adjudication law, which requires a public hearing, then in this case, either the office of the mayor or the municipal planning council can formulate the rules and regulations without taking those rules and regulations out to the community and allowing them to be able to add to the conversation. And that's where the disconnect, at least from my perspective, in terms of the requirement for public hearing. Here's a parcel property, 8.8 acres within the village of Talafofo, and really there should be a public hearing in conjunction with the formulation of the rules and regulations. Perhaps not similar to the extensive requirement of the administrative adjudication law, but the community in Talafofo should have that opportunity to provide input. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard? Madam Vice Speaker, did I understand that you wish to?
I just wanted to make one point on that amendment that's being proffered, and I too was considering that administrative adjudication might be cumbersome, but I looked at, you know, what they required for the mayor's use. Like when we transferred Tagacheng to the Jotnya mayor instead of Department of Parks and Rec, we required that they follow the rules and regs of Parks and Rec until they make their own, pursuant to the AAA. And there's also laws that say every program run by mayors are actually supposed to be run by rules and regulations. So, I mean, it's our process might be a little cumbersome, but I think in the end, it's what we're balancing. It's that public notice versus too much, you know, ability for, I don't know, unfairness, I guess. But I just think that while that might not be an issue in every village right now, and we did, you know, transfer property, we've transferred, the legislature has transferred property before without making this kind of requirement. But I think really if you look at how the mayors are supposed to be operating, they're supposed to be operating by rules and regulations already. And so I think the AAA is kind of fair. It might be a little bit burdensome, and maybe, you know, in the future we could pass a separate rule for the mayors that makes it some other kind of process. But for now, the AAA is what we've kind of, everybody knows. And the benefit of the AAA is that it's amendable, right? You can amend it anytime. You can amend your rules. So I don't know. That's what I'm foreseeing. So I just wanted to point out that that does exist. It's a requirement for their other programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Speaker. Speaker Cruz, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to the amendment because I think there are more safeguards with the Administrative Adjudication Act because, well, besides the public hearing, the fact that it comes through us and really has the force and effect of statute and is not going to be amended by a subsequent mayor and municipal planning council with a proposal that's before the body, there's no prohibition against a future mayor after the next election deciding to change the rules with the municipal planning council without us or the legislature having anything to do with it, but with requiring it to go through the AAA, if a subsequent mayor wants to change the rules, it will have to come through us for approval. So I would hope that we would take that into consideration.
Thank you. Any other member wish to be heard on the ADA? Any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? If not, Senator Ada, you're recognized to close. There's been an objection to the ADA amendment. All those in favor of the ADA amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Amendment fails. Senator St. Nicholas, you're recognized.
Just point of information, Madam Speaker. The retiring speaker spoke about the AAA process for the adoption of rules and regs, but in the motion to reconsider the amendment from the Vice Speaker that actually required the adoption of rules and regs, we no longer have a section in the measure that requires any rules and regs to be in place. The motion by Senator Ada was to create a new rules and regs requirement that was just going to be adopted by the Municipal Planning Council. Since that measure has failed, I'm inquiring, do we have any amendment that's in this bill now requiring any rules and regs at all? Because to my knowledge, based on the proceedings thus far, it was motioned, it passed, and then it was reconsidered. And then the most recent motion was to put in a lesser version of rules and regs that also did not pass. And so to my knowledge, unless I can be corrected, there are currently no rules and regs in this measure.
Point of information, Madam Speaker. I believe that the motion to reconsider basically was a motion to reconsider the vote on the amendment, on the Tulahi amendment, and that was what was brought back to the floor. And so when the amendment to reconsider came back, in other words, the vote, the amendment, the Tulahi amendment was taken back out of the bill, it is now still before us. So it needs now to be voted upon whether to reinsert or let it stand. I believe that's where it should go now. So we are now on a Tulahi amendment as it was first introduced prior to the motion to reconsider, and that was what we need to vote on now, whether this goes forward again.
Thank you, Senator Espaldon. Vice Speaker Chalahi.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is on something else. I mean, I would like to actually, while we're reconsidering this measure, amend it to, instead of where it says the lot number and that description, to say that these rules would govern the use of and access to the sports facility established by this act. If you look at page 2 of the bill, the last sentence, it describes, we're giving them administrative jurisdiction for the sole purpose of developing a sports facility. So I want the rules to govern the use of the sports facility, not necessarily access to the land when they're doing construction or any other purpose. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I make that motion, I guess, notwithstanding the rules, because it's a little confusing right now. Thank you.
Would any senator wish to be heard on the Tulahi amendment to the amendment? Senator Espaldon?
Could you just repeat the exact wording of how that works?
So following govern the use and access to, instead of describing the lot number, it would read the sports facility established by this act. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The sports facility established by this act. Any senator wish to be heard?
Madam Speaker, no, I'm fine, thank you.
Is there any objection to the Tulahi amendment? Senator San Nicolas, you're recognized.
No objection, Madam Speaker, but I'm just trying to, I'm now looking at it from the other side of the coin on this question. With this amendment to the amendment that's being proffered, now the Talafofo mayor and the council will establish the rules and regs of the sports facility. And on that end, I'm wondering, shouldn't the sports facility also have a hand in the development of the rules and regs? In other words, we understand that this lot may be likely developed for a soccer field under the soccer organization on Guam. And that soccer organization has a national organization that has its own set of rules with respect to how their invested monies are going to be put into certain facilities and what those facilities are going to require. I don't know if requiring only the mayor and the municipal planning council to establish the rules of that facility may forego that facility being eligible for monies from its parent organization, because its parent organization may have its own rules that it needs to have adopted. And so and the reason why I bring this up, Madam Speaker, is because we have two situations here. It's almost a chicken and the egg situation, where we have the land and it's government land, and we're trying now to transfer the administrative jurisdiction of that land to the mayor, who in turn will turn that land over to an organization that's going to develop it for a sports facility. Now, there's two things that we want here. We want the land that's public land to continue to be available for public use, and we want to make sure that land, when it's developed, isn't going to cause any adverse impacts to the surrounding community. At the same time, we want to make sure that we're not getting in the way of the facilitation of the sports organization actually being able to receive the monies it needs to develop the land. And so we have a very narrow road to walk here, where we try to put in place rules and regs that are going to have a kind of overarching requirement on how that land is going to be used, but we don't want those rules and regs to be so narrowly defined that they're the ones that impose on any facility how that facility is going to be operating either. So for example, if this amendment to the amendment passes and the sports organization wants to set a membership fee for its members to use the field, that's going to have to go through the mayor and the AAA process if we adopt this amendment to the amendment. So I'm just asking for the body to really look at this from the point that we have two objectives here. We have the first objective of making sure that as the land goes from general public use to being transferred over for specific purpose use by the sports organization, that we are going to have certain broad requirements, flood mitigation, general public access, but we're also going to want to enable, beyond those broad requirements, enable the sports organization to handle its own particular requirements. What time the lights get turned off, how often the restrooms get cleaned. You know, so we need to be mindful of how we're enacting this. I do want there to be rules and regs imposed on how the land is developed and the access to the land, and I believe that should come prior to the land being turned over as a condition of it being turned over. But once it's turned over, and once those conditions are met as part of it being turned over, then the organization that develops it needs to have the flexibility to impose whatever operational rules and regs it has on its particular facility, just to make sure that they're in compliance with their parent organization and the overall mission of the field. So I do have an issue with the mayor setting the rules and regs for a sports facility that may actually be developed by a third party, because that third party may have their own rules and regs that they need to put into place. And I don't know if we can impose on that third party that they go through the mayor and they go through the AAA process. So I just wanted to raise that, Madam Speaker. I'm not registering an objection at this time. I'm hoping that my comments can spark some additional discussion and hopefully we can navigate this through. But I do reserve the right to potentially raise an objection if the ensuing dialogue is not sufficient to ameliorate my concern. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Senator San Nicolas. Senator Esteves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of the amendment to the amendment. I think what that does is it really delineates it into two different categories, which is where it belongs. And I think this achieves all the goals that we're looking for. I truly believe that. There were concerns about whether or not the operation of the facility will be consistent with the rules and regulations of the benefactor or the developer. And I think that's exactly what the administrative adjudication law provides for that. If they enter into a construction contract that says, okay, we're going to build this facility for you, we want to make sure that you're an equal opportunity facility. If you charge membership fees for maintenance, it doesn't exceed $10. Lights have to be shut off by 10 p.m. You have to use recyclable this, LEED certified. All of those get determined with the construction. And so just like whenever the government engages into any type of contract, those things are binding. And so the AAA process is perfect for incorporating those things in the hardline rules of the organization and the Mayor's Council for consistency's sake in how the facility is to be used. So those issues get brought up in a very public and transparent process so that it could be identified, it can be talked about, it can be deliberated on, and then it's adopted finally by this body. And we have oversight over the facility and everything going on because we've seen both the mayor's side, we've seen the community side, and we've seen the developer side on what needs to, and if they're all in agreement, which I strongly believe they're going to end up being, then it shouldn't be a problem to move through the process fairly quickly if everything is consistent. But that's exactly why we have the AAA process, to ensure that there's a clear path to ensuring we're all on the same page. Now, I'm very happy that we removed the AAA process for determining how the land is developed. only because there are so many governing principles on how to even develop land. Before any construction begins, the developer is going to have to develop the permit, do the engineering diagram consistent with local laws, and then request for the permits through land management, public works, Guam EPA. So there are systems in place in law that are going to ensure that things like flood mitigation are all there, utilities, public rights of public access and rights of ways, any agricultural issues, all of those things have to be entertained before any construction is even done. So there are already enough laws in place that kind of mandate how that's developed. And that responsibility and onus is on us if we're really interested in this project to follow it through, to see where the roadblocks are, and to ensure too that the developer is following all the laws. But there are laws in place, both local and federal, with strict guidelines on how they need to construct that. Now, if it's a failure of those agencies that we believe in not supporting and following those laws in how they execute permit, then that's a whole separate issue that we need to identify. But I feel very confident that the process is already there to ensure that all of these checks are being made. And with the oversight of this body, we can ensure that those checks are being made. So I'm very happy with the amendment that it's split into two parts because they are two different parts. Development of the land has systems in place, and then promulgation of the rules under the AAA process to ensure everybody is in sync and everything is consistent in a fair, transparent, very public forum. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Esteves. Any member wish to be heard on the amendment to the amendment? Vice Speaker? Oh, I'm sorry. Senator Espaldon, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In reference to the concern raised by one of our colleagues about the chicken or the egg, I think we all have the understanding of how this is, and it's been spoken to here on the floor, of what the intent is by the mayor's office of Talafofo, and that's to develop this into a soccer field and working in conjunction probably with the Guam Soccer Federation and their sponsors. And so I would imagine that to be able to get to the rules, to draft the rules and then take it through the administrative adjudication process would be in concert with those that they're looking forward to develop it with. And that would be the set of rules I imagine that they would, after speaking with the potential developers of this field, right, that would be the set of rules that would then go forward through the AAA process. And that would be the way I would logically think this through, since we all know what the intention of the mayor and the council, the Municipal Planning Council is, as even voiced at the public hearing, all the parents, all the soccer parents who want to see this field be put to use for that purpose. And we're not talking about just residents of Talafofo, we're talking about parents all throughout the South. Instead of having to drive all the way to the soccer field up north, they want a facility of their own that's much easier access for them. So basically what I'm saying is that I would imagine that the mayor and the Municipal Planning Council will be working with whoever their nonprofit partner is in developing this field to come up with the rules as can be administered properly for the fair use of all. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Espaldon. Vice Speaker Shalahi.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleagues for your discussion and consideration of this amendment. I too believe, and I'm hoping that this will put the decision-making in the hands of the people of Talafofo always. And so if they want to, you know, agree with another party, that's fine, but hopefully, yes, the AAA process can take care of that, but ultimately that if the people of Talafofo decide they want this to be more than a soccer field, a multi-purpose field versus a soccer field, that's the leading decision in this whole process, and so that they decide what this field will be used for. And So I think it allows them to work with other people, but it also keeps that decision making right where it belongs. That it should not be the people of Talafofo following some third party. It should be the reverse. So I'm hoping that that's what this amendment will do, and I thank all my colleagues for their support. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Vice Speaker. On the Terlahi amendment, the amendment, is that an objection, Senator Nicholas? There's been an objection. All those in favor of the Terlahi amendment to the amendment? Amendment passes. Vice Speaker, on the main amendment?
I have nothing further on the main amendment, Madam Speaker.
Any objection to the main amendment proffered by Vice Speaker Terlahi? Hearing none, so ordered. Would any other member wish to be heard on the bill? Speaker or Senator Torres?
Madam Speaker, I'd like to proffer a very small amendment to page 3, line 8. I would like to include after the word subleased, to include the word licensed, because in looking at all the different ways that you can dispose of the property, either by selling, leasing, subleasing, exchanging, or otherwise transferring, licensing isn't encompassed within transfers, and we have had precedent with other properties in Guam where they have in fact been licensed to someone to develop or use. So I would like to include the word licensed on line 8 after the word subleased.
On the Torres amendment, would any member wish to be heard? On the Torres amendment, any objection? Hearing none, so moved. Would any member wish to be heard on the main motion? If not, Senator Atta, you are recognized to close. Send it down.
On the main motion, yes. So I want to thank my colleagues for all their input. I really think they were good. And I'm sure the people of Talafofo would, and the young folks from the South will appreciate what we've done here to basically move this forward, to make sure that property is earmarked for a sports facility, and hopefully then we'll meet their athletic facility requirements down in the South. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the favorable consideration from all the members. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Atta. I'd like to recognize Senator Uggan on Bill 116. On the motion to place Bill 108 into the third reading file. Any objection? Hearing none, so moved. Senator Uggan, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'd like to move for the placement of Bill number 116 as 34 COR into the third reading file, please.
Any objection? Hearing none, so moved.
So we went straight down to third reading.
Did.
Madam Speaker, point of order. Madam Speaker, point of order, just to, I
Senator
think
Nelson, you're recognized.
Thank you. I think that moved a little bit too quickly, and we didn't get to deliberate on the bill. So, I'm hoping we can reconsider this.
Sure.
Thank you very much to the good senator that brought that up. And Madam Speaker, just so that we're following formalities, I'd like to move for the reconsideration of the placement of Bill number 116-34 COR, reconsider it and place it back in second reading for discussion, please, Madam Speaker.
Any objection? Hearing none, please proceed, Senator Again.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you very much, senators. Madam Speaker, I now would like to move for the placement of Bill number 116-34 COR into the third reading with a brief discussion, please, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this proposal, as highlighted in the legislative intent and findings, and also as highlighted in the body of the entire legislation, as it was a direct result of several activities that took place in the latter part of May and in June regarding the signage laws. And Bill number 116-34 would address several aspects that were brought up during the course of the decisions by the Guam Land Use Commission. One was a question that was brought up as to who has the enforcement authority within the government of Guam, which entity has the enforcement authority as it applies to signage laws. And this legislation, Madam Speaker, would recognize the Director of Public Works or his or her designated representative to be the building official to have that enforcement arm on behalf of the government of Guam. Also, Madam Speaker, if you recall, there were several issues brought up with regards to several actions by the Guam Land Use Commission which was ruled as illegal. For electronic signs, that aspect was addressed by a different piece of legislation. But in this case, Madam Speaker, it would include signage as part of the consideration in addition to buildings and structures, and would create a mechanism in which, should any penalties be assessed, that the Office of the Attorney General, the building official, as well as the Guam Land Use Commission officials will be able to address that particular remedy with the property owner or with the signage owner. So, Madam Speaker, when we look at Section 2, penalties for violation, it does have that specific provision that I highlighted. You look at Section 3 as it applies to enforcement and the administration of the decisions that are rendered by Department of Public Works. It allows for non-conforming signage, if in fact any are identified moving forward, a mechanism to be able to allow for that to be addressed. So, Madam Speaker, I ask for the consideration of our body, members of this body, recognizing that this piece of legislation would address, first of all, would establish that mechanism between the different agencies within our government of Guam, the Office of the Attorney General, the Guam Land Use Commission, as well as the Director of Public Works. It would further recognize the Director of Public Works or his or her designated representative, the building official, to be the enforcement component of the government of Guam. And then it would also allow for these three entities that I highlighted a little earlier to allow for the recoupment of costs should any businesses or resident be affected by decisions by the Attorney General or the Guam Land Use Commission. So, Madam Speaker, I ask for the consideration of the members of the body. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Again. Would any member wish to be heard on the motion? Senator San Nicolas, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just have a question with respect to Section 4. Section 4 adds to the definition of what is a non-conforming building, and it adds a building or structure or sign. And then it says at the end, or which was constructed. The original language says which lawfully existed at the time the regulations with which it does not conform became effective. But then it adds language that says, or which was constructed pursuant an improvidently issued variance which was void ab initio. And ab initio means in the beginning. And so my question to the author is, who's the deciding party? Who's the one that decides if it was ab initio? And who's the one who decides if it was improvidently issued? Is it the Land Use Commission? Is it the courts? Because right now, because there's no definitive authority on who makes that determination, I'm curious as to when that language will become effective.
Do you yield, Senator?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Senator, for those particular questions. With regards to Section 4, if we can look at it from the appropriate context, this is the definition portion of the zoning code. So if we take a look at non-conforming buildings, there's an insertion of the inclusion of signage on line 7, and then in direct response to the good senator's question, improvidently issued, void ab initio would be, from what transpired in May, would be the opinion of the Office of the Attorney General, the responsibility of the Director of Public Works, and also in conjunction with working with the Guam Land Use Commission. So you take the definition component, you take a look at the enforcement component, which are sections 2 and 3, and they have to be really viewed from a totality perspective. And Senator, I hope that that answers your question with regards to who would ultimately make this decision. It's establishing that mechanism that was mentioned a little earlier that would allow for the government of Guam to ensure that should the government render a decision based on a previous action on the part of the Guam Land Use Commission, should subsequent to that application or the construction of that signage as it applies to the new provision, then and the Attorney General or the government is ruled that in fact that application was illegal from the beginning, ab initio, then it would provide a mechanism where the Office of the Attorney General, the Director of the Public Works, as well as the Guam Land Use Commission would allow that property owner, that business owner, or that resident to be able to recoup costs as provided in Section 3. So I hope I answered your question, Senator.
Senator Snickers.
I appreciate the clarification. It just raises some very dramatic concerns for me, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what this section would do is it would basically create a very open-ended question as to what the outcome will be for any variances that are issued by the government of Guam, not just with respect to signs back in May, but any variance whatsoever. Whenever a variance is issued, Mr. Speaker, it goes through a process. And after going through that process, which is a very extensive process, the Land Use Commission is the one that makes the determination to issue the variance. Now, I understand that over the past number of months, the Land Use Commission has made some decisions that are unpopular, but I'm concerned about us putting into force of law something that's going to be almost a reactionary provision to what is unpopular Land Use Commission decisions. Every single variance that is issued is not a bad variance. But what this section will do is it will allow for, as explained by the author, allow for the Attorney General to at any time render a decision that would void any variances that are issued. And what's concerning about this is that it doesn't speak to any due process whatsoever. And that was the concern of the previous issue that was addressed with respect to the signs. These companies followed the process that was laid out to them by the Land Use Commission. They went through an extensive vetting process and were issued a variance. There was a concern from the Attorney General as to whether that variance was enforceable. There was actually a set number of days from which the Attorney General could act, in which the Attorney General did not. And it was after those days lapsed that the Attorney General issued an opinion. This change would now basically say that whenever the Attorney General issues any opinion ab initio about a variance being improvidently issued, they can basically void any variance that was given. And it doesn't afford the affected party any due process whatsoever. And when you take away an affected party's due process rights and there is harm, Mr. Speaker, that is grounds for a lawsuit. And I'm not just talking about the affected parties with respect to the signs, but any time, at any given point in the future, if this becomes force of law, if any determination is made by any Attorney General, who is, by the way, an elected official, ab initio about any improvidently issued variance, I mean, I'm very concerned about that, you know? I mean, that's like an elected official being able to say, hey, you know, if you want your variance to stick, you know, elections around the corner. There's a reason why these kind of processes are taken out of the electoral process. There's supposed to be a procedure. And granted, there's been some concerns over that procedure, but there's also a mechanism to remedy that, and it affords everybody due process. This basically gives arbitrary power to an Attorney General to void any variance that they deem is improvidently issued. I mean, there is no definition or scope to narrow what that improvidently issued statement means. So, I respect the author's intent to try and corral the Land Use Commission. I understand that there's been concerns about decisions that they've been making, and they're not helping their case when they layer questionable decision upon questionable decision. But at the same time, I don't think that it's our place either to create circumstances in law that would allow for even more subjectivity. We may have an Attorney General now who's going to give us the answer that we want, but what if in the future an Attorney General that's going to do something else entirely? I think that what we need to be doing with the Land Use Commission is try and create more ironclad regulations as opposed to adding more subjectivity into the mix. And so I'm concerned about what this piece of legislation will do, because I believe that that's exactly what will happen. We're just adding more subjectivity into it. And I think that what really is the underlying problem over what happened with those signs was that we just had way too many personalities getting involved in subjective things and not enough very clear definitions that everybody's supposed to be following. I'd be interested in helping to narrow the scope of the work environment so that there's very clear-cut outcomes, but I am concerned about passing a measure that's just going to add more subjectivity to a process that should have less of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. On the main motion, Senator Camacho Torres, and then who wishes to speak after that? Vice Speaker, please. Senator Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The retiring speaker brings up a lot of points that also impressed me as I listened to the public hearing, and which I attended, and also read the committee reports. We were caught up in this idea of what is fair. Someone was issued a variance, they operated according to the variances. The variances were granted under a previous law. But what we're really discussing here, and I think the previous speaker touched on it, is that when there are disputes of law, when there are disputes about a law, generally the one to break that dispute and determine what is legal and illegal is the court system. And I know that one of the mentions that was made at the public hearing was that this was done as a result of the AG's opinion, where she opined that the GLUC erred in granting these variances, and that these variances should be void ab initio. It is rightfully the Attorney General's role to come up with legal opinions. But the legal opinion of the AG is not the catch-all. That is not sufficient to determine what is legal or not. It is the courts, when there's disputes, to determine what is legal or not. And so I think that with this type of legislation, the legislature is really not in a position to make this type of a law where it actually determines that something is void ab initio from the beginning. And so I rise with concern. You know, what is the one thing that we have to be most cognizant of with bills like this is that moving forward, this type of bill can be used against someone without a court decision. You can rely, and I think one of the retiring speakers touched on this. This sets a precedent that enables someone to bypass what is the legitimate process, the court process for determining disputes of the law. And it gives someone the ability to just leap ahead and make an improper assertion of what is legal or illegal. So I have some concerns about this legislation. I understand where we can see things as so black and white. Is it legal or isn't it legal? Were they operating under a proper variance or not? And there was some very impassioned discussion at the public hearing, and no one can argue with either of the positions. For what they were worth from their perspective, they were justifiable. But where we stand right now as a body, a policy-making body, I think that it is out of our jurisdiction to enact such legislation, because I think that when it comes to matters of disputes of law, it really is best left to the courts, particularly where it's ab initio. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator Torres. Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? On the main motion, Senator Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I like parts. I rise in support of the bill generally. I especially support the parts of this bill that in Section 2 that it's going to make it very clear who has the enforcement authority. If that's an issue right now, then I think obviously yes, we should make it extremely clear who is in charge of enforcing these sign laws, and hope that they carry out those responsibilities fairly. My issue is with Section 3 and perhaps Section 4. In Section 3, we say that the final determination or the finding of whether a sign is in violation or not, or if anyone's in violation of the zoning law, according to law now, will be determined by the Director of Public Works. But then this bill proposes to add that the Territorial Land Use Commission may abate any fines that are imposed by the other parts of this bill, which direct the AG and the DPW to work together to enforce really the penalties in our laws. I guess, Mr. Speaker, I'm just not finding it to be compelling that we allow this big exception. If one party is going to be charged penalties, then I just think it's fair that all parties are charged penalties, and not just people who violated the sign versus other zoning laws are allowed this exception, because the exception is only really allowed for those who erected non-conforming signs, not for anyone who violated the zoning law in any other way. So I would move, Mr. Speaker, that we delete this last sentence in Section 3, and that we just leave the determination as it is in current law, which would be with the Director of Public Works, And then if you refer to Section 2, it would leave the enforcement to the Director of Public Works and the Attorney General, and that we remove the TLUC's ability, or that we do not give them the ability to abate the fines after we've allowed the Attorney General to prosecute that case, and the DPW to go and impose the penalties. So I think that if we're going to fix the enforcement and delegate that we allow them to do their job and not allow TLUC to abate these fines. I don't see any reason to abate to abate the fines, especially for just one small class of people and not for everybody if we were going to do it. But I don't think we need to do that at all, Mr. Speaker. So I would suggest that, or make an amendment that we delete that last sentence of Section 3, which begins on page 2 on the very bottom. For good cause shown, the Territorial Land Use Commission may abate the fines, all the way to the end of that sentence, Mr. Speaker, which ends on page 3.
The motion is to strike the sentence beginning on the bottom of page 2, line 27, and through line 4 on the top of page 3. On that motion, go ahead, and then Senator Snickles.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the Vice Speaker, thank you for your suggestion. You know, Mr. Speaker, I was listening very intently to some of the conversation a little earlier. And incidentally, there was a decision that was made by the Guam Land Use Commission members against the legal advice of the representative, the attorney from the Office of the Attorney General, on 2 separate occasions. And then the Attorney General came out with a written opinion nullifying the decision of the Guam Land Use Commission. The legal arm of the government of Guam, on behalf of the people of Guam, rendered that in fact the decisions made by the Guam Land Use Commission members were illegal. Mr. Speaker, that's when this legislation was introduced. Shortly after that, because it recognized that we should not penalize some of these businesses that already had electronic signage operating. And it would have given the Office of the Attorney General, the Department of Public Works Director, and the Guam Land Use Commission the opportunity to be able to allow the businesses operating electronic signs at that time to be able to recoup their costs. But what was done, Mr. Speaker, by this body was instead there was a recognition of the opinion of the Attorney General, and there was legislation that was passed to legalize something that was opined as illegal, Mr. Speaker. So in this case, it's about making sure that there's an appropriate mechanism in the laws that should a business improvidently be issued a license to operate signage, and it's opined that in fact it was void ab initio, then there's a mechanism that would be established to allow the business or the resident the opportunity to recoup costs. That's what this legislation is about, Mr. Speaker. It's not about taking an illegal situation, and in my opinion, yes, an illegal situation that was opined by the Office of the Attorney General, and making it legal by passing legislation by this body. And I'm making this comment, Mr. Speaker, because this would have been an interim fix. Creating that mechanism so that the executive branch representatives, the Office of the Attorney General, the Department of Public Works, as well as the Guam Land Use Commission can be able to work with that business to allow for the recoupment of costs, and upon the conclusion of the recoupment of costs, then to no longer permit the operation of that signage. And I'm listening to some of the comments, Mr. Speaker, about who's going to render the decision, isn't the Office of the Attorney General the legal arm of the government of Guam? And we understand that if there's litigation that's required and it goes to the judiciary of Guam, then ultimately those decisions will be made through that legal process. But this would have created a mechanism that would allow for the entities, inclusive of the government of Guam and the business person, to be able to work things out without going through that extensive process. And you know, Mr. Speaker, like I said a little earlier, if this provision was codified in law, we would not have had to legalize an opined illegal action by the Guam Land Use Commission. Bottom line, and we should not be in the business of legalizing illegal activities, and in this case, not recognizing the legal opinion, the legal arm of the government of Guam on behalf of the people of Guam, which is the Office of the Attorney General. And Mr. Speaker, I understand the concern with the amendment, the concern by the Vice Speaker in terms of proposing that these particular provisions be extracted. But be mindful, Mr. Speaker, we have to ensure that there's a mechanism in place where the respective parties can get together, the government of Guam, and work with whichever business or individual, should the government of Guam have rendered a decision that is either ruled illegal or opined illegal by the Office of the Attorney General. And that's what this provision will provide. That's exactly what we could have done, Mr. Speaker, as an interim allowance rather than legalizing something that was illegal, opined by the Attorney General. So, Mr. Speaker, if we want to be a body of laws and a community of laws, we need to continue to recognize that the laws that are passed by this body have to be followed. Not because the members of the Guam Land Use Commission renders a decision that is opined illegal and they completely disregard that opinion. Completely disregarded it. And guess what? It extended to this body. Because this body reacted and passed legislation that made all those illegal signage legal. So all these statements about having concerns, yes, they're valid concerns from your perspective, but if this piece of legislation was in effect, we would not have had to do, or the legislature would not have had to act the way it did. And then you ask yourself, why did we act to legalize something that was already opined illegal? So they don't have to go through the judicial process? Or because we know someone that's sitting on the Guam Land Use Commission board and we want to reinforce their decisions? That's why, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to situations like this, we need to ensure that if we're going to pass laws, then let's follow it. We're going to pass laws and the AG comes out and opines that that's illegal, then we, if the government was at fault, need to create a mechanism so that it does not negatively and directly impact the business in terms of cost recovery. But give them that opportunity to be able to work with the government of Guam and then eventually transition. What we should have done as a body is pass a law, Mr. Speaker, that would have addressed the electronic signage.
Point of information,
moving forward.
Mr. Speaker.
I understand. Getting back to the amendment, Mr. Speaker.
It's a point of information.
I want to thank.
Information, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the point of information I'd like to make is that the mover of the amendment, and the amendment was to strike a certain section, which would be the sentence that we talked about. And the argument that she placed forward as the reason for the removal of this sentence was that any determination, as the law reads now, it says any determination of findings of the violation of zoning laws by the Director of Public Works or a designee shall be final. We were talking about zoning laws. This amendment now addresses, this whole new policy that's being introduced now adds signs. And the sentence that the mover of the amendment moved to delete basically is questioning why does this apply only to signs and not zoning violations. And that's, I believe, the crux of the motion to delete, is that the zoning, this provision of law, which right now speaks only to zoning violations, right, now just targets violations of signage, not zones. And I believe that was the crux of her motion to delete this section, at least as I understood it when she explained it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Senator, anything further on the
on the proposed amendment, Mr. Speaker? You know, we're here, we're discussing a proposal. If you feel that the inclusion of sign is appropriate on line 26, and you would like to extend it to zoning, then you have the prerogative. And I understand that the proposal is to delete all of the underlined based on the concerns that were raised by the Vice Speaker. But I had to, Mr. Speaker, share how we got to where we're at today and why we are here, why this proposal would create a mechanism, propose to create a mechanism so that the government of Guam, should something be ruled improvidently issued and void ab initio, and the error is on the part of the government of Guam, that a mechanism is in place to not impose undue harm to a business or an individual. So, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to express those concerns, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Do I take that to be an objection to the amendment? No? Okay. On the Terlahi amendment, Senator Nicholas.
Oh, okay, Mr. Speaker. You know, there's just so much backstory to what is underlying with respect to all of the different components of this bill. And in particular, with respect to this amendment, the amendment seeks to strike out certain language. And it is my understanding that that particular language is added in order to try and address the potential for harm that this bill would otherwise create. And I just want to read the language that's being proposed to be stricken. On page 2, line 27, it starts by reading, "For good cause shown, the Territorial Land Use Commission may abate the fines allowed by 21 GCA section 61670 until the cost of erecting the non-conforming sign is recovered, or upon the election of the sign owner for a period not to exceed 1 year of the date of the final decision by the Director of Public Works or his designee." Just the language in and of itself just jumps at me for a variety of reasons. First, we're allowing the Territorial Land Use Commission to abate the fines when, based on the author's explanation from the author of the amendment, isn't that commission the very body that put us into this situation to begin with? And now we're giving them the authority to abate the fines? I mean, I'm getting very, very dizzy trying to figure out who's right and who's wrong and why we're doing this. And then they say they may abate the fines, which means that it's subjective. And then it says, until the cost of erecting the non-conforming sign. Is recovered. Now, if it's non-conforming, why are you going to let them recover it? Ab initio, Mr. Speaker, means in the beginning. You know what is ab initio in this whole conversation, Mr. Speaker? The Attorney General's office was present throughout the entire proceedings that resulted in these variances ab initio. They were there since the beginning. And it wasn't until at the end that the matter
Let's stick to
was...
what's being struck. There's no ab initio in the section being struck.
No, Mr. Speaker, but in the section being struck, it does refer to non-conforming signs. And if we're going to be now defining something that's non-conforming as something that was issued improvidently ab initio, we need to clearly understand why the ab initio portion of the non-conforming is relevant.
And so let's stick to what's being struck, and then we'll go to the ab initio sections if that's your desire after we finish with this motion.
The only reason why I raise it, Mr. Speaker, is because this section that's being struck is referencing non-conforming, and we are now changing the definition of what is non-conforming to something that was improvidently issued ab initio. I mean, it's all now part of the non-conforming aspect of this section. And so in this particular section, the removal of it, should it be removed or should it be extended to everything that had a variance that was issued, that was eventually found to be improvidently issued and void ab initio? When we talk about what's legal or illegal, we need to remember that there are 3 branches of government, and this is not the judiciary. If the Attorney General finds something to be illegal, she has all the powers vested in her office to be able to take it to court. It's not our duty in here to try to be judge, jury, or executioner. We are lawmaker. When there's a confusion in the law, we can pass a law to clarify. Nothing very out of the ordinary about that. But if something is illegal, we are not the body that's going to make that determination. I don't think we should be trying to pursue justice in the form of determining what is legal or illegal by trying to just keep legislating away. The Attorney General has all of the tools available to her to be able to make that determination and can so do so. But at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, whether we strike this section or we keep it, we need to remember that laws ex post facto, after the fact, only create more liability if the government does not afford the affected parties due process. I object to the amendment to strike it. I think that at the very least, it should be expanded to all zoning that falls under the definition of this section and not just to signs. But I think that if we're going to be doing something and allowing for a party to be affected after the fact, trying to at least allow them to recover the costs may perhaps reduce our liability, I don't know. But altogether, I just don't think that the measure in and of itself is something worth pursuing at this time, given the fact that the Attorney General hasn't even filed any kind of action in the courts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator wish to be heard? Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just like to reiterate that it's very clear the bill has several purposes, some of which, as the author of the bill described, might not be relevant anymore because the legislature in the interim passed a law that legalizes the 2 signs that are being described in this bill, or the signs that they were trying to address in this bill. that's one of the reasons why I think we need to delete this last section that says that we're going to make an exception for non-conforming signs. But I believe that the bill, when it points out in section 2 that we want penalties, we want enforcement, that our law already allows for penalties for violations of our zoning laws and our sign laws, and we want these to be enforced. So the bill tells us who's going to enforce it and gives them all kinds of authority to enforce these things. I think that's very good, and I think that section 3, we go backwards. We go and we make a big exception, not by the people who are being tasked with the enforcement. We create a process whereby the TLUC may abate fines, may abate the enforcement. And so let's say the Attorney General takes a case to court and says, you violated, and now, and if I may just remind my colleagues, Mr. Speaker, that this is we're talking about penalties for a crime, a petty misdemeanor. And so I just think that's a very serious thing, and if the AG pursues that, and if the Department of Public Works pursues that, then why should we allow the TLUC to abate these fines? Why? It's, I don't know, I feel like we're just going around in circles, and we can't, but I know this was put in, and it was made very clear in the discussion that this sentence was put into this bill to take care of the problem that existed when the TLUC did not follow the AG's opinion and allowed a variance on a couple signs. But that problem is moot, Mr. Speaker, because of the law that passed that made those signs legal. So I don't believe this section is necessary anymore, and it would just be opening it up for future cases that the TLUC might want to abate fines, and I just can't, we don't give anyone that kind of authority where after we've prosecuted them criminally, in fact, that we are going to allow some other authority to abate the fines that have been imposed. So I think it only makes sense. It makes sense because of what has happened in the interim, and it makes sense because of what we can actually accomplish in just getting tougher on the penalties and enforcement of those penalties, that we remove this sentence, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any objection to the Terlahi amendment? There is an objection. Do you have the motion to strike? All right, there's a motion to there's an objection to the motion to strike. All those in favor of the Terlahi amendment to strike the last line on page 2 and the 4 lines on the top of page 5, all those in favor of the Vice Speaker's amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes. Okay. On the main motion.
Mr. Speaker, do I still have the floor, Mr. Speaker?
Please, yeah, we're back on the main motion.
All right, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would also like to make an amendment on section 2, Mr. Speaker, on the underlined portion in line 18 where it says actions shall be brought by the Attorney General at the request of the building official. I would like to add the words shall be brought by the Attorney General at its own discretion or at the request of the building official. This is a crime, Mr. Speaker, and according to our system of government and our system of prosecution is brought by the Attorney General at her or his discretion. And I don't think we can, take that away at this point, because they have to determine whether their case is strong, whether, they can they have a good chance of succeeding, whether their resources allow them to pursue this versus other cases. That's the reason they have discretion, is because of limited resources. So, I mean, I like that we include at the request of the building official, because he is the one who's designated to make, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, it just keeps echoing to me in this microphone, but so yeah, so that would be my amendment, to add, just to make it clear. I think it should be clear, according to our system of government, that it's at her discretion, but I would add the word, shall be brought by the Attorney General at, I'm not sure the pronoun to put there, I put at her, its own discretion, or her own discretion, that's all I would add, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
All right, the motion is to add 4 words, at her own discretion or. Anyone wish to speak on that amendment?
Mr. Speaker, the amendment is specifically where?
Right after Attorney General. Brought by the Attorney General at her discretion or at the request of the building official. Is that clear with everybody? Anyone wish to address that? Yes, Senator Nicholas.
Mr. Speaker, I mean, this would just add another layer to what I would view as problematic with the bill. You know, one of the things that we always try to do in this government is we try not to allow for any single party to very arbitrarily render determinations and then to go after those determinations when it comes to due process for the community. So, in this instance, the section reads, actions to recover the penalty provided for in this section shall be brought by the Attorney General at the request of the building official. The building official being the Director of Public Works. And the reason why that is delineated is because the building official is supposed to be the one to say, hey, you know what, yeah, we're going to go ahead and pursue the penalties because they haven't remedied the problem. When you add at her discretion, or at the discretion of the Attorney General, now, if you go back again to page 3, section 4, we're allowing the Attorney General to determine what's improvident. We're allowing the Attorney General to determine if it was ab initio or not, and then we're just going to allow the Attorney General to go ahead and bring the penalties. Now, an Attorney General can just go around. You can go down a list, tell the Land Use Commission, give me the list of everybody that you gave a variance to. They give the Attorney General the list. All she has to do now is write a letter to all of them saying you're all improvidently issued and it's all ab initio, and I'm assessing a penalty onto all of you. No due process whatsoever. Even to get the variance, they went through a due process. Now, throughout this measure, we're going to allow for discretion to throw out all of that due process that the citizen went through and to penalize them without any due process after that. Zero checks and balances. Mr. Speaker, I don't understand why there is so much intent to throw out the due process rights of people who are going through a variance procedure that, again, granted, could be done so much better. But you don't just throw out people's due process by allowing them to all of a sudden have variances that they were issued be improvidently determined, be determined ab initio by decree of one individual, and then be brought to court and be penalized, not even brought to court, just have the penalty assessed by one individual.
Point of information, Mr. Speaker. The bill is very clear. We're talking about actions to recover penalties for crimes. Those are only done in courts of law. There's no better description of due process than going to a trial. So I don't understand what this, I object to this discussion of no due process, and I think, yeah, the bill is very clear, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when I read this section, it says that they shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. And the actions to recover the penalty provided in this section shall be brought by the Attorney General at their discretion. Which also, by the way, such discretion was granted for them to decide if it was a violation to begin with. I object to the amendment, Mr. Speaker. I object to the measure overall.
Thank you. An objection has been raised. Any other person wish to be heard on the Terlahi amendment? On the Terlahi amendment, do you wish to close, Madam Vice Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, very briefly, I just want to say that I'm just trying to make this bill better. I think this section of the bill is good. I mean, I think maybe, you know, we all thought this was the case in any event, that nobody can bring an action for criminal prosecution except for the Attorney General. We're reiterating it here. We're also reiterating her authority, her discretion. And we are reiterating that what is also said in other parts of the Title 21, the building code, which is that the building official is the person who has the power and duty to enforce these provisions of law. So he will make the determination, he will make the findings, but this is the problem of all our regulatory agencies. If we don't get the Attorney General to prosecute those violations, then we don't get very far. And that's why they need to cooperate with each other. And this is the same case with EPA and other regulatory agencies. And so this is a good portion of the bill, Mr. Speaker, if it makes that very clear. Thank you.
There's been an objection to the Terlahi amendment. All those in favor of the Terlahi amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion fails. On the main motion, any senator wish to be heard on the main motion? If not, Senator Camacho Torres.
Mr. Speaker, I'm still struggling with Section 4 and the additions to Section Z and to Section AA, or subsections Z and subsections AA of Section 4. This is page 3. By including the language underlined at the end of those sections, which reads under Section Z, or which was constructed pursuant to an improvidently issued variance which was void ab initio, and then again in AA, which was constructed pursuant to an improvidently issued variance which was void ab initio. I'm struggling with that because that declaration of it being void ab initio was done by the Attorney General, who I don't believe who has the authority to enforce laws on Guam, but her recourse to enforce laws is through the court system by initiating suit and having the court determine in matters of dispute what the answer is. I have issues with this because it seems like by including this in the legislation, we are then validating that in fact the AG's declaration through an opinion that these actions, these variances are void ab initio stands as a matter of law and statute. I don't agree that that's the case. I think that that's absolutely wrong. We're missing the point here. And it's I was lost in the discussion during the public hearing, but as I looked closer at this, what became apparent is we are setting a precedent where this will now bypass what is the actual true course. The legislature as a policy maker has the role of drafting policy and passing policy. The AG is an executive function. She enforces laws. The court system is the body that determines when there are differences of opinion, challenges to the law. which argument prevails. And I just want to bring us closer to that. So I want to proffer that we strike the last parts of the sentences on subsections E, Z, and AA of section 4, because I believe that we are validating something that is an improper conclusion in this piece of legislation. So I would proffer that amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator. The amendment proffered by Senator Torres is to strike line 9 and 10, starting with the or, and 13 and 14. On the Camacho-Torres amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Any senator wish to be heard? If not, is there any objection to the motion by Senator Camacho-Torres? Any objection to the striking those lines? Hearing none. On the main motion, you may close, Senator. On the motion to send the bill to the voting file, any objection? Hearing none. Senator Morrison on Bill 138.
Mr. Speaker, I move to place Bill 138 as substituted by the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform to the third reading file. And I'd like to briefly speak on it.
Hearing no objection, you're recognized to speak.
First off, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank Chairman Atta and the committee for conducting 2 public hearings on Bill 138. Although Bill 138 was available for discussion during last month's session, legal counsel requested for additional time so that his office could prepare additional discussion. I thank his office for preparing what we have before us today, a slightly edited Bill 138 as substituted by the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform. Mr. Speaker, in March of this year, the Guam Visitors Bureau forwarded a letter it received from the agency's roadside maintenance contractor, basically detailing the impact excessive and poorly maintained political signs had on safety of its personnel and on their ability to clean our roadways and shoulders in a timely and efficient manner, where rebar, wires, and other sign materials left behind from the 2016 campaign causing damage to the company equipment. Mr. Speaker, we also heard from former Senator Bob Klitsky during both public hearings on Bill 138 about the safety dimension of political signs, recalling an accident in Jigo a few years ago where a person was killed possibly due to another driver's visibility being obstructed by political signs as their vehicle exited an intersection. I introduced Bill 138 knowing full well that I too have contributed during these past 3 elections to dangerous and unsightly conditions on our roadways and shoulders. Moving forward, I hope to lead by example by helping to improve the way political signs are regulated through the restriction of signs on public property. It's no secret, Madam Speaker, that campaigns have free rein to put up as many signs as they can afford to put up on public property, without any consideration of the kind of impact these signs have on our safety, environment, and tourism industry, with signs being placed in Guam's tourist district, along beautiful parks and overlooks, and in front of or otherwise within close proximity to cultural and historical sites. The people of Guam, including some of us in this legislature, are huge supporters of various island-wide beautification efforts, including the most recent Guam International Cleanup. Bill 138 offers us an opportunity to be proactive and avoid campaign signs littering our roadways every 2 years, a situation that expands during periods of heavy rain and whenever weather disturbances pass throughout our island. I wish to thank Senator Bob Klitsky for actively engaging in the public hearings on Bill 138 and for reminding us that campaign signs alone don't guarantee your success in an election. Despite coming from a small family, having a relatively unfamiliar last name, and believe it or not, only a couple of campaign signs, Senator Klitsky finished in the top 10 for the legislative race and eventually served a second term. With Bill 138, we have an opportunity to change this aspect of our elections. Our people want us to reform the way political signs are regulated. A PDN poll was conducted related to this, and 74% of those surveyed were in favor of changing our political signs or political signs laws. Let's encourage candidates to focus their time, energy, and campaign resources to engaging voters on the issues, participate in community forums, village meetings, earned media opportunities, social media, and yes, even some roadside waving. With the 2018 elections a year away, we're already experiencing the beginning of what will be a very competitive race, or competitive races. With a number of campaign signs placed on private properties across our island. I'm not sure, Madam Speaker, if you have received any complaints recently from our people or concerning any of these signs. Like the many complaints we've heard about every campaign year. Have we heard from GVB about roadside maintenance equipment breaking down because of rebar and wires being all over the place? So far, have we heard from constituents concerned about campaign signs being eyesores along Guam's scenic routes, or about campaign signs being placed in front of cemeteries, or in Tumon, or close to intersections where visibility is compromised? I never thought, Madam Speaker, that I'll see the day along the scenic route through Sedza Bay and Seti Bay that I'll ever see a political sign there. As a matter of fact, Madam Speaker, for the past 3 elections, three campaigns, even though I live in the area and I always pass through it, I'd never thought to even put one sign there. But the recent past elections, Madam Speaker, you know when it's getting out of control, when you're seeing these scenic routes where tourists pull over to the side of the road to avoid all these signs to try to get what they come here for, a nice photo or image of those areas. Mr. Speaker or Madam Speaker, I haven't heard any complaints so far, and I have a strong feeling that people aren't complaining yet because the campaign signs that are already up are located on private property. I do want to point out, Madam Speaker, that our office and working legal counsel, we have tried our best to make this bill as best as we can to address the concerns of what we see out there every election cycle. We did try to attempt to introduce legislation to even minimize the amount of signs out there. The feedback from our community has been overwhelmingly strong about political signs on public property. There's many other jurisdictions out there that have prohibited signs on public or rights of way. I mean, if you look at a area similar to our area with limited landscape, of course a little larger, such as the state of Hawaii, they have statutes that control this type of advertising that basically doesn't allow for political signs on their rights of way or any boundaries on government property. We just recently had a roundtable discussion with our tourism folks or experts and those in our community on how to address what's been happening with the industry. We know there's factors out there beyond our control. Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that we want to point out here is one factor that we all know that we can control here is our image. And I know that every election cycle, I pointed out that I am also part of this issue. And I think this is one step in a direction where we can control it. It addresses the concerns out there with regards to private property. That is no longer in the bill. That is gone. It's stricken out. So all those signs that are already out there, I'm sure, like I stated earlier, we're not getting complaints because those are all on private property. And I also want to point out, Mr. Speaker, that I think it's good for candidates. I mean Guam is not so big, but I think we all understand. I think going through the campaign process when we're erecting signs, and especially those that want to get out early, that it allows us to engage with the residents out there, especially if we're asking for permission to put on these private properties. And that is, to me, a more better form of being part of the process, not only just throwing up a sign, but engaging with the residents out in our community. So I think as this body or the 34th Legislature, we can lead by example and change this whole aspect of how we go about putting up our political signs or erecting political signs. So this does not impact any signs that are out there right now. So those are some of the concerns that were coming our way. I want to make that very clear. So I asked Mr. Speaker for my colleagues to join me in supporting Bill 138, and hopefully we could help be part of, I said leading an example, but I know there is other concerns about other signs that are erected out there, such as nonprofit organizations, other organizations that are putting signs up there. But before we could start attacking that issue, let's start with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Morrison. On the main motion, Bill 138, any senator wish to be heard? Any senator wish to be here? Vice Speaker?
Could I just get a 1-minute recess, Mr. Speaker, or could I request a 1-minute recess?
Okay. Any other senator wish to be heard and we can hear? Senator Mary Camacho Torres, please.
Mr. Speaker, if the mover of this bill, author of this bill would so yield, I'd like to ask a question.
Please, pose your question.
I'm just wondering, with regard to Section 4, regulation of political signs, where it was repealed, there are some very practical and good guidelines contained in here that, if the author would so yield, were there considerations given with regard to the, the timing he mentioned, you could allow people to get their signs out earlier. So there is a section here, period, for posting of political signs. Right now, it's 60 days before a special or primary election. That, I believe, is a very useful and practical part of sign regulation. Sign restriction, perhaps now that we're dealing with private properties, there are safety issues with regard to sign dimensions. And I know that in other jurisdictions, Mr. Speaker, they not only allow for political signs on private property, but they regulate the size of it to the equivalent of a yard sign, a 1 by 2 feet dimension. So size restrictions, I think, might be something that perhaps we want to reconsider. The maintenance of the political signs so they're not a hazard, especially since it's on private property with families traversing in and out on a daily basis, and also the removal of signs, because we don't want to, in proposing this, one of the main concerns for those who were for regulation of the signs was to take away from the clutter and to also make it a lot safer for travelers. But by putting it just on private property, you create in sorts another type of hazard for the community. And if the author could maybe elaborate on whether sign regulations were considered and why he chose to strike and repeal that entire Section 4 regarding the regulation of signs, political signs.
Thank you very much. Do you yield, Senator Morrison?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I yield to the question. I thank my colleague for sharing her thoughts regarding this. We did this pertains mainly to those signs erected in public property, Mr. Speaker. So even if this section stood or remained in this measure, it would, private property issues or those concerns of the type of size and how it's erected, how it's secured. I think as what will still be in place is through the encroachment process or the building permit process or encroachment, they would make sure those requirements are followed, just like anything you would be constructing at a home. I'm sure DPW should have some ability to enforce or ensure that those signs will not harm those homes adjacent or those neighbors within their community. But this was particularly to guide candidates within the rights of way issue. But since we are eliminating public property, or the proposal of 138 is to eliminate all signs of public property, this section we felt was not necessary.
Thank you very much, Senator Morrison. Senator Torres, is that sufficient, or do you have anything on the main motion you'd wish to add?
Mr. Speaker, I think that in the interest of the aesthetic beauty of our island and the interest in our population to rid ourselves from unwanted clutter and what has been described as a nuisance during political season, that perhaps we should at the very least have include in this bill, restore some sections with regard to regulation, particularly with size restrictions, maintenance of political signs, and the removal of the signs, because I think that then would allow people within their private properties to endorse candidates and the like, but it doesn't create an avenue for them to do bigger, better, and more than what would happen if erected on public spaces. So I do believe that there is a safety concern in terms of how large the signs are that go up, the maintenance of the signs, and the removal of the signs. Because over time, we know that, things wear and become a safety hazard in our climate. So I would proffer an amendment to include where Section 4 is repealed, to include and modify, of course, to reflect private property placement, include the following sections, subsections, which would be F, size restriction, G, maintenance of political signs, and G2, which is the removal of the signs, which is no later than 15 days, calendar days following the general election. So that would be my amendment, Mr. Speaker.
There's been an amendment proffered by Senator Camacho Torres. Can we just have a short recess?
I'll withdraw my amendment. I believe that there's room to modify it after the fact, and so I would rather that I spend more time with the author, because he's invested a lot of time dealing with this, and we can vet it and maybe come back with additional legislation later.
Thank you very much. Senator Ada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the bill here to ban the political signs in the public rights of way. But maybe if the author would yield, I guess, to what extent are we going to prohibit political signs on these public rights of way? So does that mean now that I cannot go out there and hold my sign, elect me, and I will stand out there at the tri-intersection? Does this bill then prohibit me from doing that?
Senator Morrison, do you yield?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for sharing that concern. I don't think Bill 138, Mr. Speaker, would prohibit such an activity. I mean, we're talking about public rights of way or public property, but I mean, we're talking about a human sign, or a sign that's attached to the individual or the candidate. I don't think Bill 138 will prohibit that activity, but I welcome any amendment that would want to make that more clear, that activity can be allowed. But certainly that is something that wasn't our intent, to stop that activity, or that activity of expressing someone's views or through waving on the streets.
Senator Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, then, maybe to make it perfectly clear, I would like to proffer an amendment and add a new section. I don't have it written yet, but it's a really simple thing. Basically would say, this act shall not prohibit signs that are attended by the candidate. So in other words, I can, the bill should not prohibit me from going out there and holding my sign, my elect me sign, It should not prohibit me, with my amendment, it should not prohibit me by, we've seen candidates out there who basically will set up their truck with their sign, maybe, the Burma Shave sign series, but they're there attending to their sign. When they have finished their waving, they need to gather it up, because if they just drive off, then they would be in violation because they are not attending to the sign. So I know a candidate that used to do that. Set up his sign, hold it. He had a series, and when he was finished, he gathered it all up and he went home. So if you want, we can take a recess, maybe come back tomorrow, and I'll have that amendment ready. But it's a simple one. The act shall not prohibit political signs on public rights of way, so long as the candidate is attending to those signs. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Nicholas.
Nicholas, yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. On that proposed amendment that I'm sure will be drafted well, just two other items that perhaps can be incorporated in it. The first is, as I read the bill, what comes to mind also is truck signs, vehicular signs. That may even include a bumper sticker, because technically the way the law is written is that it has to be 8 feet from the public rights of way. We would then be prohibiting signage on vehicles, on trucks, so that needs to be taken into consideration. And then another item is Election Day, Mr. Speaker. One of the very common themes on this island is on Election Day, especially for a gubernatorial election. Various camps are set up on the roadway on the way into the polling sites. Those are usually set up sometimes on private property, but oftentimes you'll see the signage also onto the rights of way. Are we going to prohibit any visibility on Election Day? I just wanted to kind of put that out there as something that needs to be considered going into this election cycle. So those two items, Mr. Speaker, perhaps they can be incorporated into the proposed amendment or considered by the author. Vehicular signage to include bumper stickers, which would be affected by this, and also Election Day signage. Are we going to completely just ban it all the way up until, just even inclusive of that day? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm willing to take a recess until tomorrow morning, but at this point, unless I'm mistaken, this bill only wants to repeal the sections as it relates to requiring those signs that require Public Works approval and a license, it would seem, and permanent and erected during that period that's allowed. There's no prohibition against a temporary sign that doesn't require a Public Works permit.
The way I read on page 1, section 5, starting on line 4, it will amend it to say political signs which advocate voting for or against candidates or other matters to be considered by the electorate, provided that such signs shall only be posted on private property if such private property, for example a car, is adjacent to any roadway. Political signs shall be at least 8 feet from the paved portion of the roadway and posted in such manner that would not impede traffic or a driver's visibility. That's "and" posted. So the way that we're going to be amending the statute here is that because it's creating a more restrictive environment, it would apply to vehicles, because vehicles are considered private property. And so I'm just concerned, Mr. Speaker, that we're going to be creating a much more stringent environment than I think is being intended.
I think if everybody looks at the bottom of page 2, the definition of political sign, it means billboards, posters, banners, which advocate for a political office to be presented, and all items put on public property to erect or secure the billboards, posters, banners, or display, including rebars and wires. That shows the permanence.
Mr. Speaker, what section of the bill are you referring to?
The bottom of page 2 and the top of page 3, the definition of political signs. Subsection 4. In section 4, regulation of political signs and the definition of what a political sign.
Point of information, Mr. Speaker. You are referring to a section that is being struck out by this legislation?
No, I understand, and that's what I'm saying is what we're striking is everything that the meaning of political sign as per these sections.
That's correct, Mr. Speaker. And so when we strike it, it's no longer limited to those particular items. It means every item. Because we're now removing it meaning billboard or poster or banner. Now it could also mean bumper sticker, decal. Because we're making it, the measure actually makes it far more restrictive because we're opening up the definition and we're making it very specific that you cannot do these things unless it's on these particular places. And even on these places, it has to be 8 feet from the road. So we would actually, because we're striking that section, it would create those circumstances that I mentioned earlier.
All right, I'll take a recess until 9 tomorrow morning. In the meantime, legal counsel has agreed to assist anybody who wants to work on an exemption if it feels necessary.